Hello, and welcome to Ardent. In today's episode, we tackle a cultural conflict that has been present for decades, one that doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. While listening to today's episode, keep in mind that while I explain the two different sides to this conflict, I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong. The goal of this episode is to show and explain both points of view and the reasons behind them, because I personally believe that compromise is absolutely impossible without understanding. And while I talk about the French side or the English side, please keep in mind that these are each extreme ends of the conflict, and many people mediate between the two. Let's get started. Now, at the beginning of this episode, I told you that this is a decades-old conflict, and so we're gonna start with a little history. One could credibly argue that this conflict stems all the way back to early Confederation days. From the very beginning and the creation of this country, there were what I would call multiple mutual misunderstandings. To put it very simply, within Canada, there were two big groups: an English-speaking community that was loyal to the British Crown, and a French-speaking community that was loyal to France. When these two communities came together in order to form the Confederation of Canada, the French nation felt that they were taking part in the union of two distinct nations, whereas the English nation felt they were agreeing to the creation of one new nation state that could be defined as Canadian. Since then, and to not have to dive into each decade of Canadian Quebec history, Quebec has communally felt to be victims of collective oppression, dependence, and exploitation, rather than the decolonized, independent nation that they thought to be asserting themselves to be. Beyond these collective traumatisms, another factor that made the French-speaking side feel threatened is the huge influx of immigration into Canada in the 18th century that was largely English-speaking, really confirming their own nation as a definite minority and creating a sentiment of fragility and insecurity that remains to this day. To English Canada, the coming together of the two nations was to promote unity and a unified people. It's important to keep in mind that at the time and during any nation-building process in history, fear of revolt or civil war or of outside forces taking advantage of internal disunity was a very real and legitimate threat. To English Canada, the French and other minorities were seen as a threat to the nation-building process and were therefore comfortable assimilating them into the larger nation in order to maintain strength and stability. Fast forward a little to today, and I suppose it's a good time to enter into the discussion around language on a national scale. On the Quebec side, the grievance is basically that French speakers are not given the same respect and rights outside of their province as English speakers are given inside of Quebec. Basically, what they're referring to is that in Quebec, French is the official language, but most services, and especially government services, can usually be found in English as well. I say usually because realistically, most Quebecers speak only French. And I'm not just pulling that number out of thin air or from my own experiences. This is a fact according to a 2011 Canadian census. So you basically have less than a 50-50 chance to have the possibility to be served in English unless the company or organization itself makes an effort to ensure an English-speaking staff is on hand at all times. And this does not go the other way around. While one half is strictly French-speaking, the other half of Quebec is not made up of strictly English speakers. If you can't find a French speaker to serve you in Quebec, that's either a freak of nature or you're probably within an immigrant or small English-speaking community. I say this because whereas half of Quebec only speaks French, the other half, including Anglophones, can speak both English and French comfortably. They're bilingual. And less than 5% of the population only speaks English. A big part of this conflict was originally centered around language and its eventual disappearance. And while many feel that the language debate is kind of exhausted and maybe outdated, it's actually entirely valid. But this validation extends to both sides of the debate. The worry here is basically that the smaller language community will be assimilated and eventually be wiped out by the larger language community in question. And so, while that means for Quebecers, they're worried that their province's language will disappear at the feet of the country of Canada, Canadians are equally worried about the well-being of English speakers within Quebec. And to be clear, this phenomenon in which the larger language assimilates the smaller language is a thing. It's real, and it really happens. And that's kind of the natural progression of things, unless substantial action is taken. However, you can notice substantial differences in regard to this phenomenon between Quebec and the rest of Canada, because in Quebec, legislative action has been taken, yes, to protect and strengthen the French language within the province, but also by definition alienates the English speakers within the province as well. To exacerbate these differences and these tensions, both sides kind of view this as a competition. And to make matters worse, this is viewed as a zero-sum game where whatever one side loses, the other side gains, and whenever one side gains, the other loses. I think that kind of makes compromise pretty difficult. And this leads us to the real issue at hand here, which is the balance between being part of a national identity while still being able to, or not being able to, maintain its distinctiveness. 56% of Quebecers believe that it is important that Canada recognize that Quebec is a distinct society, which is actually a lot, since even within Quebec, the population rarely agrees in majority about any issues within this realm of debate. But yes, most Quebecers believe its distinctiveness should be recognized, and this gets validated for a few different reasons. But the biggest and most important argument that supports this is that this recognition of distinctiveness, if it comes with action, would lead to a level of sovereignty in which Quebec can gain powers if things are essential to the preservation and promotion of its distinct society. The best way to protect this distinct society is to obtain the ability to self-govern. To English Canada, this is a little scary. The fear is that if the federal government concedes these powers to Quebec, the concessions will never end. Canada is called a cultural melting pot for a reason. If concessions are given to this minority group, there will be one more valid argument available for the other minority groups scattered throughout Canada. The fear here is that governing such a country with so many distinct nations who govern differently becomes ungovernable. On top of this, recognizing Quebec as distinct and special amongst the other provinces fundamentally goes against what has become the Canadian value of multiculturalism. Canadian multiculturalism insists that diversity of all kinds is welcomed and celebrated, and though a minority group may possess some different features, they're seen as equals within society. For Quebecers, this very value goes against their affirmation as being special and distinct, as they believe there must be a place for differences. In Quebec, interculturalism replaces multiculturalism as an option that integrates and assimilates minority groups into the Québécois culture, strengthening and protecting their national identity and fighting against the possibility of disappearance. And so we're left with a situation in which the Canadian side wants to uphold its status quo of multiculturalist equality for the reasons of upholding its values and out of fear, and in which the Quebec side wants to impose its distinctiveness for the reasons of protecting its values and out of fear. Now, with all this in mind, I'd love to toy with a couple questions that may seem a little harsh, but that I think are important nonetheless. My first question is addressed to those who share the Quebec point of view. If the argument is that distinct communities, and especially founding communities, should be respected and given distinct recognition, what efforts are being done within Quebec to do the same thing for Indigenous communities? And according to the logic of history, why should Quebec's recognition pass before Indigenous recognition? My second question is addressed to those who share the broader Canadian point of view. As a government, since when is it more important to protect and promote personal aspirations and agendas for the country rather than those of the communities your job it is to protect? My last question applies to both. What can be done and what isn't being done in order to reach a compromise? Whichever point of view that you have, are you making an effort to understand why this is a conflict of interests in the first place? If you have a point of view that you'd like to share, or if you have an interesting answer to any of the tough questions I've asked, I'd love to hear it. You can find a link where you can leave me a voice message down below. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time.